Hi. We continue in Luke 5 today in verse 4, having introduced in the first 3 verses last time elements of the Galilean fishing economy using the work of K.C. Hansen to help us understand the cultural context a bit here. If you're not familiar with that, I encourage you to go back and watch the last video or use the resources I posted on the website from Hansen that allow you to understand a little bit of both the language and the procedure that we're seeing here in this scene, a very realistic scene of fishing in the Sea of Galilee in the first century. On the right side of the screen, you can see that we divided Luke 5 into several separate scenes, unlike what we saw in chapter 4, where they were closely parallel. Jesus twice in the synagogue on the Sabbath, for example, once in Nazareth and once in Capernaum. But here, these stories are not as directly linked, and we can see from the bold headings that these are just simply stories that are juxtaposed next to each other without suggesting that they're sequentially chronological. In fact, sometimes we can't even tell where they are, like in the next one in 5:12, it just says one of the cities, or in 5:17, while he was teaching, which doesn't say where. So we pick up today in verse 4 when he had finished speaking here. And a number of elements of this story worth paying attention to, including the fact that it's strangely parallel to a story in a very different context, and that's John 21 at the very end of John's Gospel. Let's look at that a little bit, just to see the contrast and comparison between these two here. So the parallels we see, that Luke on the left and John on the right, that they're fishing at night and catching nothing. And then Jesus comes to them in the morning, described slightly differently, but similar scene there. Then another couple curiosities. The sons of Zebedee only mentioned in Luke in this place and only mentioned in John in that place. James and John don't have that big a role in Luke. They'll only speak once, and it'll be negatively, as we'll see way later. But they're only called the sons of Zebedee here. And in John, the sons of Zebedee are not named as James and John, but this mentioned is only here. So there's something about the tradition that keeps that connected with this story. And then, as we see in the next blue section, there's an issue of their nets being filled so much that they could break. And the word for net there, diktuon in the singular, diktua in the plural in Luke, is only in this scene in Luke and only in that scene in John. John numbers the fish at 153. Luke just says so many the nets were about to break. And although each of them use different words to describe breaking, clearly the scene is similar that way. And it's followed up in Luke by Jesus telling them that they will be catching people, whereas in John, Jesus asked Peter 3 times over breakfast, "Do you love me?" and feed my sheep and care for my sheep in the context of building community. And then finally, in the end of Luke, when they brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him, although Jesus didn't call them to follow, and there's no word of discipleship here. And then strangely, perhaps in John, Peter is told by Jesus to follow, and that's the only time in John's Gospel that Peter is called to follow. In the initial scene in chapter 1, when Peter does follow, the verb isn't used there. So whatever's going on in the tradition that links Luke 5, this scene, and John 21. And that leads many scholars to try to analyze Luke in terms of potential sources that Luke and John have in common. And that may be so. I personally don't find such work fruitful, that it doesn't lead us too much to know that Luke and John might have had a common source for a story that they use wildly differently. And let's look at a couple of those differences. The most obvious one is where they take place in the narrative context. Here in Luke, this is the first narrated scene between Jesus and Simon, and it's the last narrated scene between Simon Peter and Jesus and John. So that's a huge difference. They've been through a lot together in John, including Jesus' passion and death, and now it's the risen Jesus who's talking. In Luke, because it's early in the story, Jesus walks up to them in an ordinary way, but in John, the disciples don't know it is the risen Jesus until later. And then finally, the contrast is Luke is interrupting these people during business time when they're cleaning up after their failed fishing trip at night. But in John, there's a breakfast on the beach that figures fish and bread, and in the dynamics of John's Gospel, it's parallel to the meal of fish and bread in John 6. That one emphasized bread, this one emphasized fish, as a symbol in both of evangelizing and widening the community. So whatever the original sources are, Luke is not taking this from Mark, although there are elements of Mark's initial call scene that are similar here, but I didn't want to make it that complicated by trying to show you multiple sources. And one of the elements that scholars sometimes accept and sometimes don't is that maybe Luke's just making some of it up himself, that he's a writer and not just a collector, and so he's not just taking sources and cutting and pasting them together, but he's taking sources and modifying them using some of his own language, as we'll see, and also shaping it to meet his needs. So in this case, the fishless night leads to this encounter with Simon here. And I'm going to put up here the language of catching, and I'll come back to that as we look through the scene just a little bit here. So he got into one of the boats, and that initially brings up the question of hospitality that I mentioned last time from Paula Parker, and here you can see her. And it's in connection with what we see in verse 4 where we're starting today. When he had finished speaking, Jesus that is, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water." And the word here is bathos. And I have a note from it here, but I wanted to show you here in a direct quote. And she says this: Jesus asked Simon Peter to go out into the deep. Often the deep is interpreted as chaos, the unknown, spiritual darkness, disorder, danger, unproductive effort or work. But other interpretations are fullness, immensity, an extreme degree, immeasurable insight, infinite knowledge, or incomprehensible plans. In other words, bathos, the word for deep here, or the concept deep in English, carries a wide range of symbolic and metaphorical meanings. And she refers to the great African-American writer and pastor Howard Thurman in his book, The Luminous Darkness, to highlight this. So I'll post this piece on my website, and you can read the whole thing for yourself. But what's at stake here, in addition to the immediate scene, is Jesus taking Simon out into the deep. And I think that's important here because plainly the story highlights on just Jesus and Simon. We're only going to find out later, as we see down here in verse 7, that they have partners, and then we'll see that they're named James and John, as we already showed in the previous chart. But they're not in the story. Really, the context is there's crowds on the boat, or crowds on the shore that Jesus is teaching from the boat, but this is about Jesus and Simon. And plainly that he had sat down and taught, we hear nothing about what he taught. So it's just that's what he's doing, but this is not a teaching scene. This is a scene where Jesus is trying to lead Simon into trusting him and succeeds in doing so, but not in a linear way, as we'll see. So he says, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." The word for let down, kalao, is only here in the next verse in Luke, and it's primarily a Luke Acts word, as you can see. It's only two other places outside. It's not that it's a particularly important word as such, it's just the word for letting down nets, but it highlights one of the elements that we're seeing throughout, is that Luke uses much of his own vocabulary in Luke Acts. It's different from the other Gospels. So after Jesus tells Simon that, we hear this from Simon. Here's the parallel with John 21. Simon answered, "Master." And this is the first time we're hearing Jesus addressed this way, epistates. Later he'll call him Lord. And you can see from my note below that Master is a title for Jesus a number of times. It's interesting, and many commentators have noted this, that since there's no formal discipleship relationship, why would Simon be addressing Jesus as Master? All we know is that they have some relationship that Jesus felt not only free to, but was invited to come into the home of Simon's mother-in-law to take care of her fever. But treating him as a master here suggests there's more going on that Luke hasn't narrated. So we just have to leave that as it is, that Luke is showing us that he's selecting stories and there's more going on that we aren't seeing in his text. So he says, we've worked all night. The word for work here, kopiasantes, literally means to toil wearily. The word ergos for normal work, as in the physics unit for measuring energy, erg, is a more common word for working. But this is to say they're exhausted. They've not only worked, but they're worn out. The fishing at night isn't a normal way to do it. You'd catch the fish when they'd be feeding at night. And so now in the day, having caught nothing, they feel like it's been a failure. And yet we hear this response, "Yet if you say so." I'll look here for the particular phrase that Parker notes there in my note, "deto remati su," that rema, the word for say so here, is commonly used in the New Testament when the Lord is speaking his dynamic, living word to instill faith. In contrast to, say, logos, the simple word for a word, but rema suggests a sacred saying or something important to listen to. So even though all that Jesus has told Simon is something every day, put down your nets and for a catch, the fact that it's during the day, not the normal time, is what makes it special, and Simon expresses trust in it and does it anyway. And when they had done this, literally when they had made this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. And this brings up the chart on the right side of the language of catching in Luke 5, 4-10. And so I highlighted two places in blue where the same word is used, agron or agra, two different forms of the same word. And at the bottom you can see what each of these verbs mean. But all of them except lambano are unusual words. Lambano is the everyday word, and we see it many times, 21 times in Luke, with a range of meanings. But these other words suggest other specific things. Sunacleo, in the form sunaclason that we see in 5:6 literally means to encircle. And perhaps that's simply a description of the dragnet that we saw in the last video, being thrown out and encircling fish as opposed to catching them on a line with a hook. And so it's perhaps just simply descriptive and not symbolic there. You see it's only used in Galatians and in Romans, elsewhere in the New Testament. And then we'll see finally at 5:10, zogreo, which is a definitely unusual word, and we'll come back to that when we see the context of it there. I'm inserting myself into the existing video here because I left out a point when I first time I recorded this that I want to emphasize at this place. So looking at verse 6, you see the phrase, so many fish. And this is what I left out here. You see the word plethos, literally a fullness of fish. But the rest of the times the word plethos is used in Luke's gospel. It means a multitude of people. So plainly that's a connection here. The fish symbolize gathering people just as they do in the Gospel of John. Zogreo, which is a definitely unusual word, and we'll come back to that when we see the context of it there. So going back to our scene here, when so many fish, their nets were beginning to break, and diariseto is the word for it here, beginning to break, as opposed to in John's Gospel, they did not split, and the word there, schism, for split is used later, not later in the Gospel, but later in history, for split within the church, when there's a difference of points of view that lead to a split in the church, as opposed to heresy, where there's simply differences in doctrine, and individual people might be expelled or disciplined in some way. So like the eventual schism between the Eastern and Western churches. So perhaps that's the symbolism in John's Gospel, that there's so many fish caught, but they're all contained in one net and not split. But Luke uses a different image. It's beginning to break, but didn't break. So moving up on our screen so we can see the rest of our passage here. So they signaled, caught nous in here, only here in the New Testament. Again, part of Luke's unusual vocabulary. It's hard to get a lot of nuance on what a word means when it's only used in a rare place. But it does suggest that they're too far apart to be able to talk directly, or perhaps it's too noisy because of the crowd or the waves or something like that. To their partners here, metakois normally means business partners, but has a sense of theological partners later, as you see in my notes from Hebrews. Certainly this is not a theological term here. These are partners in the fishing business, but we'll see a different word for that in just a minute here. So hang on, we'll see another way their relationship is referred to. At this point, we hadn't heard that they had partners, or there was another boat. Again, this is part of Luke's putting the spotlight on the relationship of Jesus and Simon, while still being realistic to know that fishing was not a one-person operation. And again, last time I showed you Hansen's chart that showed the relationship between people who might own a boat or have the Roman granted rights to use a boat versus hired help that they would use to do some of the menial tasks. And so perhaps partners are distinguished from the others that we'll see later. And so they came and filled both boats. Pimplemai here, the word for filling, and we'll see how that plays out in an interesting way in just a moment. So both boats are filled here, not just the nets, but the boats are filled. So much that they began to sink, much like the nets began to break. The word bouthazo here is a very unusual word, only here in one other time in the New Testament. It's used a couple of times elsewhere in the Septuagint, but not in relation to this. It's the normal word for something in the process of sinking. So here there's a threat, unlike in the John's Gospel scene where they bring the boat to shore and have a nice breakfast. Here it's such a big catch that it's a threat to them. And that says an interesting thing, perhaps, about Jesus' relationship here, that he brings them abundance, but so much abundance that it's threatening. But, of course, it'll not ultimately be threatening because they don't sink. So now we get to Simon Peter's response. And you see in my note below, and we'll look back at this some more when we look at the scenes thing, the double pairs of stories here that we see, and that's a common pattern that we'll see in Luke's Gospel. So we'll come back to that later. And now for the first time he's called Simon Peter, and not only that, the only time he's called Simon Peter. And what's strange about that is Peter is a nickname meaning rock or rocky, and later we'll be told that Simon was called by Jesus Peter, but we don't know that here. It's presented like we assume it, and after this he's simply referred to as Peter throughout the rest of Luke and throughout Acts. So it's odd that Luke doesn't associate the name change with both either the call of discipleship or Jesus' action to rename him. It's just suddenly he's got this extra name with no explanation. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, which is a very unusual scene here. The word for falling down is a normal word for falling down, and we see several other examples of it in Luke Acts. But falling down at somebody's knees, this is the only place. Normally one would fall at somebody's feet, or fall on one's knees at somebody's feet. But falling at somebody's knees is a curious description, and it's not clear exactly what Luke's trying to convey in that. I've not found any scholar that has a direct insight into why falling at Jesus' knees. Peter saying, "Go away from me, Lord, a sinful man," will echo the centurion in chapter 7, who also thinks that he's not worthy of having Jesus under his roof. We'll see that later. Let's look a little more closely at the language of this here. The go away is an imperative form. It's a strong word. And note that it's in contrast, as my note shows below, with the people in Capernaum, who seek to see who Jesus is for them, but Peter's encounter leads him to feel unworthy. And note that he wants Jesus to go away because he feels sinful, whereas the folks in Nazareth wanted to have Jesus go away because they thought he was sinful, or if not sinful, at least not helpful to them. Notice how he had called him master, but now that he's experienced this catch of fish, he calls him Lord. And this is the first use of kyrios toward Jesus in Luke. It'll be used by characters and by the narrator. And it's also the first use of sinful here, hamartolos, which you can see a number of times as sinners, and Jesus is criticized later for associating with sinners, and yet here it is. And so Jesus doesn't deny that Peter's a sinful man, but what he will change is the fact that he's a sinful man is not a reason to push Jesus away. In fact, Jesus is here precisely to lead such people to a closer relationship with God, with the earth, and with one another. So now we see that Luke brings out what was true all along, but his spotlight had hidden. For he and all who were with him, Pontos there, all who were with him were amazed. And so that includes both his partners that we saw in verse 7, but also probably the hired help. And perhaps it also includes the crowds on the shore, although they're not with him in that specific sense. The amazed here, thambos, recalls not only 436, but the chart I've shown, and you can see on the website, of the language of amazement throughout Luke's gospel, which usually indicates that people are stopped short, but it's not itself an expression of faith. It's something that can lead to faith if they follow up on it. So it's not clear exactly yet. And of course, they're amazed not at Jesus, but at the catch of fish, which they had taken here, the matching verse 5 here, along with catch. So now we get near the end of it, and now we find out these other characters are here. And notice there's an ambiguity here, for in verse 9 it says, he and all who were with him, but also. So if this is all, it's strange that there's an also in addition to the all. Perhaps all who are with him includes James and John amongst the all, and that's what's being specified here. But it's also interesting that James and John are first mentioned here, but they have no part. They're just mentioned in passing and only as the sons of Zebedee here, who are partners with Simon, and this is the other word, koinonoi, and that's what we saw from Hansen as a common word in the Greco-Roman world, especially in the Roman world, for being partners in an endeavor. And of course, it'll become part of the church language that we'll see in Acts later. So now that all these people are amazed, Jesus said to Simon, only to Simon. And notice still there's no Andrew, Simon's brother. We'll only see him named in chapter 6 in the list of apostles. So he's not in the scene at all or mentioned. And John and James are not spoken to here, only to Simon. And so we hear, do not be afraid, spoken of previously by Gabriel, as we saw 3 times in the early stories. It'll be repeated by Jesus a number of times. It's the most commonly repeated command in the Bible. Nothing else is even close. Do not be afraid. And the reason he should not be afraid is this. From now on, you will be catching people. And that takes us back to the language of catching that we saw here. And the word for catching, zogruo, is a strong word. As you see here, it means to bring under control and continue to restrain. Like take captive, but it also means to take alive rather than by killing. So it's not like hunting fish or animals that you would catch to eat, but taking as it can be used as prisoners of war. Plainly here, it's not meant as a threat. It's meant to be people that would be included within the circle of Jesus. But the idea of continuing to restrain makes it a questionable thing there, because Jesus certainly isn't about restraining people, but inviting people. So we'll see how that plays out way later in Acts. So finally, to the last verse of our scene, when they had brought their boats to shore, or literally upon the earth, They left everything and followed him. And the left everything, aphentos panta, is used a number of times as a discipleship word, even though discipleship or disciple is not mentioned here. And there's three aspects of role of wealth in Luke we'll look at later. One of the things that we've learned, Sue and I, in our work over on Luke's Gospel over the years, especially from Luke Timothy Johnson, who's written wonderful books on Luke, is that Luke's Jesus does not have one response to wealth. And there are many different responses depending on context. It's much more of a discernment role. So here, these fishermen, even though only Simon was addressed, leave everything and follow. Why might they do that? Well, if we go back and look at the fishing economics chart and article from last time, you might note that much of their hard work was going to support the Romans. The salted fish was a form of mobile protein that could feed soldiers, and the Romans obviously had many soldiers. What else can soldiers eat that will keep them strong? So having salted fish is a military advantage, and the Sea of Galilee fish could go to the Romans and not to the profit or to the eating of Simon and his neighbors in Capernaum and other towns around the lake. So although Luke doesn't highlight their economic struggle with the Romans, the audience would certainly know it and not need to be told. And putting that explicitly would be, laying it out on the table for somebody to find and read, perhaps more explicitly that he'd be anti-Rome than he wants to allow people to assume without reading more carefully. And we'll see later how scholars have argued about whether that makes Luke pro-imperial, anti-imperial, or neutral by his not often explicitly calling for people to be contrary to Rome. But I think, as we've already seen in the infancy narratives, that what Luke is showing all through Jesus' ministry that we're seeing here is the beginning of an alternative social order, in contrast to the kingdom of Caesar, the kingdom of God. And so by following Jesus here, and the first time we're hearing the question of following, and we see a number of times here, they will follow Jesus into a way of life that includes everybody, and the net will not break. And we'll see how that goes in our next scene next time. See you then. Bye-bye.